Judge Marcus Williams sat behind the wheel of his black BMW, his tired fingers drumming softly against the leather steering wheel. The digital clock on his dashboard showed 7:45 p.m., much later than his usual departure time from the courthouse. The setting sun cast long shadows across the clean, suburban streets of Arlington, Virginia, as he drove home after another busy day of court proceedings. At 52 years old, Marcus had earned every bit of his success. Growing up in a working-class family in Baltimore, he had worked his way through college and law school with scholarships and part-time jobs. Now, after 15 years serving as a federal judge, he had gained a reputation for being fair, thorough, and deeply committed to justice. His colleagues respected him, and lawyers who appeared in his courtroom knew to come prepared. Today had been particularly challenging. A complex criminal case had required his full attention, and he had spent extra hours reviewing documents to ensure his ruling would be fair. His black judicial robe now hung neatly in the back seat, and he had loosened his tie, looking forward to a quiet evening at home with his wife Patricia and their teenage daughter Michelle. The BMW glided smoothly through the residential streets. Marcus always drove carefully, knowing that as a black man in an expensive car, he could attract unwanted attention. It was a reality he had learned to live with, even as a federal judge. He had taught his 16-year-old son James the same careful habits when he started driving last year. His mind wandered to the family dinner waiting at home. Patricia had texted earlier about making his favorite pot roast. The thought brought a smile to his face, erasing some of the day's tension. Their brick colonial house was just 10 minutes away, and he could almost smell the home-cooked meal. The car's radio played softly in the background, classical music from his favorite station. Beethoven's Symphony No. 7 filled the quiet space. Marcus had developed a love for classical music during his college years, finding it helped him concentrate while studying. Now, it helped him transition from the intensity of the courtroom to the peace of home. As he turned onto Maple Avenue, Marcus noticed the streetlights beginning to flicker on. The early October evening was pleasant, with trees showing the first hints of fall colors. Children were heading inside after playing, and neighbors were walking their dogs before dark. It was the kind of peaceful suburban scene that had drawn him and Patricia to this neighborhood 12 years ago. He checked his rearview mirror, a habit formed over decades of driving. That's when he first noticed the police cruiser following him. Marcus maintained his speed exactly at the limit, making sure to signal properly as he turned onto Oak Street. The police car stayed behind him, its presence making him increasingly aware of every small movement he made. His hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Despite his position as a federal judge, despite his expensive suit and prestigious car, despite all his achievements, Marcus knew what might come next. He had been here before, many times, from his college days to last year. Each time, he handled it with the dignity his parents had taught him, the same dignity he now taught his own children. The blue and red lights suddenly flashed in his mirror. Marcus felt his heart rate increase slightly, but his face remained calm. He checked his speedometer one last time, exactly 25 miles per hour in a 25 zone. His registration was current, his insurance up to date, his license clean. Everything was in order, just as he always made sure it was. Following the procedure he knew by heart, Marcus turned on his right blinker and slowly pulled over to the curb. He positioned the car carefully, making sure to leave enough space for the officer to approach safely. With practiced movements, he turned off the engine, placed his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, and took a deep breath. As he waited for the officer to approach, Marcus thought about the young lawyers he mentored, especially the ones of color. He often shared his experiences with them, teaching them how to navigate these moments with both dignity and safety. Tonight's encounter would be another story to share, another lesson to teach. Through his side mirror, Marcus watched the police officer step out of the patrol car. The approaching footsteps were slow, measured. The moment that would change two lives was about to begin, though neither man knew it yet. Officer James Reynolds approached the black BMW with his right hand resting near his weapon, a habit formed during his 8 years on the force. At 32 years old, he had spent his entire career patrolling these suburban streets. The beam from his flashlight swept across the car's clean exterior, then through the rear window. Through the driver's window, he saw a black man in a suit sitting perfectly still, hands placed exactly where they should be on the steering wheel. Something about the driver's calm demeanor caught Reynolds' attention. Most people fidgeted or reached for their documents, but this man waited patiently, staring straight ahead. License and registration, Reynolds said sharply, his flashlight beam moving across the interior. The car was expensive, immaculately clean, with a dark suit jacket hanging in the back seat. Something that looked like a judge's robe was there too, but Reynolds dismissed it. He had seen people try to impress him with all sorts of props before. Officer, Marcus spoke clearly and calmly. I'm going to reach for my wallet in my right jacket pocket, and then I'll get the registration from the glove compartment. Is that okay? Reynolds nodded, watching every movement carefully. The man's voice was steady, educated. He moved slowly, deliberately, pulling out a leather wallet. When he opened it, Reynolds' flashlight caught the glint of a gold badge. His stomach tightened as he read the credentials. Federal Judge Marcus Williams, United States District Court. The registration, when presented, was perfect like everything else. Reynolds stood there, his mind racing. He had pulled over the car because it seemed out of place in this neighborhood. A black man in an expensive car. Now he realized his mistake, that it was too late to simply walk away. Judge Williams, Reynolds said, his voice losing its edge, I apologize. I didn't realize. Marcus turned to look at him directly for the first time. His eyes were tired but kind, holding none of the anger Reynolds expected. Officer Reynolds, he read the name tag. May I ask why you pulled me over tonight? Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. He had no valid reason, and they both knew it. The judge's car hadn't been speeding, hadn't swerved, hadn't done anything wrong. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the soft hum of passing cars and the chirping of early evening crickets. I made an assumption, Reynolds finally admitted, lowering his flashlight. A wrong assumption. I apologize, Your Honor. Marcus studied the young officer's face. He saw shame there, and something else, a willingness to acknowledge his mistake. It wasn't the first time Marcus had been profiled, but something about this moment felt different. Officer Reynolds, Marcus said carefully, I could file a complaint about this stop. It would go in your record, maybe cause you some trouble. He paused, watching Reynolds brace for the worst. But I don't think that would solve anything. Reynolds looked up, surprised. The judge continued, Instead, I'd like you to meet me in my chambers next week. Not for punishment, but for a conversation. Would you be willing to do that? The offer caught Reynolds off guard. In his 8 years on the force, he had never heard of a judge reaching out like this after a traffic stop. He expected anger, a complaint, maybe even a lawsuit. Instead, he was being offered a chance to talk. Yes, Your Honor, Reynolds said quickly. I would appreciate that. Marcus pulled out one of his business cards and wrote something on the back. Tuesday, 2 p.m. My clerk will be expecting you. He handed the card to Reynolds, who took it with slightly shaking hands. As Reynolds walked back to his patrol car, his mind was spinning. He had started this stop thinking he might find trouble. Instead, he had found something entirely different. A chance to learn, to change, to do better. Marcus watched in his mirror as the police car pulled away. He took a deep breath, his hands finally relaxing on the steering wheel. Patricia's pot roast would be cold by now, but he had a feeling this evening's events would lead to something important. Sometimes, he thought, justice worked in unexpected ways. Neither man realized yet that this brief encounter on a quiet suburban street would spark changes that would ripple through their community for years to come. The real story was just beginning. Tuesday arrived with the crisp chill of mid-October. Officer James Reynolds stood in the federal courthouse lobby, feeling out of place in his civilian clothes, a blue button-down shirt and khaki pants. His police uniform, which usually gave him confidence, hung in his closet at home. Today, he was just James Reynolds, a man facing the consequences of his actions. The marble floors and high ceilings made his footsteps echo as he followed a court clerk to Judge Williams' chambers. His heart beat faster with each step. The business card with the judge's handwritten note felt heavy in his pocket. He had read it so many times over the past 4 days that the corners were starting to wear. At exactly 2 p.m., Reynolds sat in a comfortable leather chair across from Judge Marcus Williams' large oak desk. The office was impressive but welcoming, with walls lined with law books and family photos. A large window overlooked the city, letting in warm afternoon sunlight. Thank you for coming, Officer Reynolds, Marcus said, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had during the traffic stop. He had removed his judicial robe and sat in his shirt sleeves, making the meeting feel less formal. "Would you like some coffee?" Reynolds nodded, grateful for something to do with his hands. As Marcus poured 2 cups from a coffee pot on a side table, Reynolds noticed a photo on the desk. It showed the judge with a teenage boy next to a car, both smiling proudly. "That's my son James," Marcus said, following Reynolds' gaze. "He just got his driver's license last year. Before his first solo drive, I had to have the talk with him." Reynolds looked confused. "The talk?" "Not that talk." Marcus smiled slightly, but his eyes were serious. "The talk about what to do when, not if, but when, he gets pulled over. Keep your hands visible. Move slowly. Say, 'Yes, sir,' and 'No, sir.' Don't argue, even if you're right. Make it home alive." The words hit Reynolds like a physical blow. He looked down at his coffee cup, shame burning in his chest. "Judge Williams, I'm so sorry about the other night. I had no right to." Marcus held up his hand. "I didn't ask you here for more apologies, Officer Reynolds. I asked you here because I saw something in you that night. The ability to admit a mistake and learn from it. That's rare, especially in your profession." Reynolds looked up, meeting the judge's eyes. I didn't think I was." He struggled to find the right words. "Racist." Marcus finished gently. "Most people don't think they are, but we all carry biases, assumptions we don't even realize we're making. The question is, what do we do when those biases are exposed?" For the next hour, they talked openly. Marcus shared stories about his journey from a working-class Baltimore neighborhood to the federal bench. He talked about the countless times he'd been pulled over, questioned, or followed in stores, even while wearing his judicial robes. Reynolds listened, really listened, for the first time understanding how his actions affected people's lives. "I have a daughter your age," Marcus said near the end of their conversation. "When she was little, she wanted to be a police officer. She thought police were heroes who helped people." Reynolds felt his throat tighten. "What happened?" "She saw too many stories on the news. Too many traffic stops gone wrong. Too many deaths that could have been prevented. Now she's studying law instead." Marcus paused, letting the words sink in. "But I still believe police officers can be heroes, Officer Reynolds. It just takes courage. The courage to face our own prejudices and change them." As their meeting drew to a close, Marcus stood and extended his hand. "I have a proposal for you, if you're interested. Our community needs better understanding between law enforcement and citizens, especially people of color. Would you be willing to work with me on something?" Reynolds stood too, taking the judge's hand firmly. "Yes, Your Honor. Whatever you think would help." As he left the courthouse that afternoon, Reynolds felt different. The shame was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, hope, and a determination to be better. He didn't know exactly what Judge Williams had in mind, but he knew this was just the beginning of a much longer journey. Behind him, in his chambers, Marcus Williams smiled slightly as he put on his robe for afternoon court. Sometimes, he thought, justice worked best outside the courtroom. 1 week after their meeting in the judge's chambers, Officer James Reynolds sat nervously in a small conference room at the community center. Judge Marcus Williams had invited him to observe a youth mentoring program, but Reynolds wasn't sure what to expect. The room slowly filled with teenagers, most of them black and Hispanic, along with a few police officers in civilian clothes. Marcus walked in wearing casual clothes, a polo shirt and slacks, looking very different from his courtroom appearance. The teenagers greeted him with respect and genuine warmth, clearly comfortable in his presence. Reynolds watched as the judge pulled up a chair, making himself level with the young people rather than standing over them. "Today," Marcus began, "we have a new friend joining us. This is Officer Reynolds, and he has an important story to share." He nodded encouragingly at Reynolds, who felt his mouth go dry. Standing up slowly, Reynolds looked at the young faces watching him. Some showed curiosity, others suspicion. He took a deep breath and began speaking. "Last week, I made a mistake," he said, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger. "I pulled over a black man in an expensive car because I thought he didn't belong in that neighborhood. That man turned out to be Judge Williams." The room grew very quiet. Reynolds continued, sharing honestly about his assumptions that night and what he had learned since then. As he spoke, He noticed the teenagers leaning forward, their expressions changing from suspicion to interest. "The judge could have reported me," Reynolds admitted. "He could have tried to get me fired. Instead, he invited me to talk, to learn, and to do better. That's why I'm here today." A young man in the back raised his hand. "Something like that happened to my dad last month," he said. "But the officer didn't want to listen. He just gave my dad a ticket for no reason." Other stories began pouring out. Teenagers shared experiences of being followed in stores, stopped while walking home from school, or questioned in their own neighborhoods. Reynolds listened, really listened, feeling the weight of each story. Marcus watched quietly, letting the conversation flow naturally. He had organized these youth meetings for years, but today felt different. Having Officer Reynolds there, admitting his mistakes and listening to these young people was creating a new kind of dialogue. "What made you change your mind?" a teenage girl asked Reynolds. "About how you saw Judge Williams that night?" Reynolds thought carefully before answering. "He showed me dignity when I hadn't shown it to him. He made me see him as a person, a father, a judge, someone who had worked hard all his life, not just as a black man in an expensive car." "But not everyone you stop is going to be a judge," another teenager pointed out. "You're right," Reynolds nodded. "And that's exactly what I learned. Every person deserves that same dignity, regardless of who they are or what they do for a living." The conversation continued for 2 hours, moving from personal stories to ideas for change. The teenagers offered suggestions about how police could better interact with their community. Reynolds found himself taking notes, seeing his job through new eyes. Near the end of the session, Marcus stood up. "Officer Reynolds and I are working on a new program," he announced. "We want to create regular meetings between police officers and community members, especially young people like you. Would any of you be interested in helping us design it?" Hands shot up around the room. Even some of the teenagers who had been most skeptical at the beginning seemed eager to participate. Reynolds felt something he hadn't expected: hope. After the meeting, as they walked to their cars, Marcus turned to Reynolds. "What did you think?" "I think." Reynolds paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think this is just the beginning. Those kids have so much to teach us if we're willing to listen." Marcus smiled. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Ready to take this to the next level?" Reynolds nodded without hesitation. The nervous officer who had walked into the community center hours ago was gone. In his place stood someone beginning to understand his role in creating real change. As they parted ways, both men knew their work was just beginning. But something important had shifted that afternoon. A bridge had started to form between two worlds that had been separate for far too long. 1 month after the community center gathering, Judge Marcus Williams stood before a packed conference room at the police department's training center. Officer Reynolds sat in the front row, along with 30 other police officers and an equal number of community members. The tension in the room was visible: uniformed officers on one side, civilians on the other, with an invisible line dividing them. "We're here today," Marcus began, his voice carrying the same authority it held in his courtroom, "because a traffic stop showed us how much work we still need to do. But more importantly, we're here because that same stop showed us how change is possible." He gestured to Reynolds, who stood up and joined him at the front. The officer looked different now, more confident, but also more humble. He carried himself like someone who had found a new purpose. "Most of you know me," Reynolds said to his fellow officers. "A month ago, I made a mistake that could have ended my career. Instead, it opened my eyes." He turned to face the community members. "And now I'm asking for your help to make sure other officers learn what I learned without having to make the same mistake." Together, Marcus and Reynolds presented their plan. They called it Bridge the Gap, a new training program that would bring officers and community members together for honest conversations and shared experiences. It wasn't just about talking, it was about understanding each other's lives. An older officer in the back raised his hand. "With all due respect, we already have diversity training. How is this different?" Marcus smiled. "Because this time, you won't be sitting in a classroom watching videos. You'll be meeting real people, hearing real stories, and sharing your own." He paused, looking around the room. "And because this time, we're not pointing fingers or assigning blame. We're building bridges." A young black woman stood up next. "I lost my brother to police violence 2 years ago," she said, her voice shaking. "Why should I trust that this program will change anything?" The room grew very quiet. Reynolds stepped forward. "Ma'am, we can't change what happened to your brother. But if you're willing to share your story, you might help prevent it from happening to someone else's brother." As the meeting continued, more people spoke up. Officers shared their fears and frustrations about doing their jobs in an increasingly divided world. Community members talked about their experiences with racial profiling and police harassment. Instead of arguing, people actually listened to each other. Marcus watched as the invisible line down the middle of the room began to blur. He saw officers nodding in understanding at community members' stories. He noticed civilians leaning forward to hear officers explain their perspectives. Small moments of connection were happening everywhere he looked. Near the end of the meeting, Reynolds introduced some of the teenagers from the community center. They had helped design parts of the program, ensuring that young voices would be heard. When they spoke about their hopes and fears regarding police, even the most skeptical officers in the room paid attention. "This program isn't just about talking," Marcus explained as the meeting drew to a close. "Each officer will spend time in the community they serve, not patrolling, but participating. And community members will get to experience a day in the life of an officer through ride-alongs and simulations. Understanding goes both ways." After the meeting, as people lingered to talk in small groups, Marcus noticed something remarkable. People weren't staying separated anymore. Officers and civilians were mixing, exchanging contact information, making plans to continue their conversations. Reynolds approached him, smiling. "It's really happening," he said quietly. "When you first suggested this, I wasn't sure it was possible." Marcus watched as a tough-looking veteran officer exchanged phone numbers with the woman who had lost her brother. "Change is always possible," he replied. "Sometimes it just needs a catalyst." As they left the training center that evening, both men felt the weight of what they had started. Their simple traffic stop had grown into something much bigger, a real chance to heal old wounds and prevent new ones from forming. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in a long while, hope felt stronger than doubt. 6 months after launching Bridge the Gap, Judge Marcus Williams sat in his office reviewing the program's progress reports. The numbers on the papers told an encouraging story. 200 officers had completed the training, complaints of racial profiling had dropped by 30%, and community satisfaction with police interactions had improved significantly. But it was the personal stories that really showed the program's impact. On his desk lay a stack of letters from both officers and community members. Each one described how the program had changed their perspective. Marcus picked up one from a veteran officer who had initially been skeptical. "After 20 years on the force, I thought I knew everything about policing. This program showed me how much I still had to learn. Last week, I stopped a young black man for a broken taillight. Instead of approaching with suspicion, I remembered our training. We ended up having a real conversation. He's now interested in becoming a police officer himself." Officer Reynolds knocked on the office door, entering with his own stack of papers. He had been promoted to sergeant last month, partly due to his work with the program. More importantly, he had become its most passionate advocate. "You need to see this, Judge," Reynolds said, handing over a local newspaper. The headline read, "Police Community Program Draws National Attention." The article detailed how other cities were reaching out, wanting to implement similar initiatives. "We're getting calls from departments across the country," Reynolds explained, sitting down. "They want to know how we did it, how we got officers and community members to trust each other enough to make this work." Marcus leaned back in his chair, remembering that night 6 months ago when Reynolds had pulled him over. "Sometimes the best lessons come from our biggest mistakes," he said thoughtfully. Later that afternoon, they visited one of the program's training sessions at the community center. The scene was dramatically different from their first meeting. Officers and civilians sat mixed together, not separated by invisible lines. They were participating in a role-playing exercise, with officers experiencing what it felt like to be unfairly profiled, while community members learned about the challenges officers faced. A young officer named Sarah Chen was sharing her experience. "I never understood why people of color seemed so tense during traffic stops," she admitted. "But after going through the simulation as a civilian, feeling that fear and uncertainty, it changed everything about how I approach my job." Next to her, a black teenager named Marcus Thompson nodded. "And I never thought about how scared officers might be, not knowing what they're walking into. We're all just trying to make it home safe." Reynolds watched the interactions with pride. The program had evolved beyond their initial vision. Now it included joint community service projects, sports events between police and local youth, and regular dinner meetings where officers and families shared meals and conversations. Marcus stood up to address the group. When Officer Reynolds and I started this program, we hoped to prevent other traffic stops like ours. But you've all taken it so much further. You're not just preventing problems, you're building relationships that make our whole community stronger. After the session, they walked through the neighborhood together. Children playing basketball waved to Reynolds, calling him by name. An elderly woman sitting on her porch invited them for lemonade, something that would have been unthinkable a year ago. "Remember how nervous I was that first day at the community center?" Reynolds asked as they walked. Marcus smiled. "You've come a long way since then. We all have." They stopped at a street corner where a police car was parked. The officer inside was chatting with a group of teenagers, all of them laughing together. It wasn't part of any program or initiative, just a natural interaction between an officer and the community he served. "That's what success looks like," Marcus said, pointing to the scene. "When it stops being about programs and training and just becomes how we treat each other." Reynolds nodded. What had started as a single traffic stop had grown into a movement that was changing their city, one conversation at a time, and they were just getting started. 1 year had passed since that fateful traffic stop. Judge Marcus Williams stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., facing a room full of police chiefs, judges, and community leaders from across the country. Sergeant James Reynolds sat in the front row, along with several graduates from their Bridge the Gap program. A year ago, Marcus began, his voice carrying through the large conference hall. A routine traffic stop could have ended in anger, complaints, or worse. Instead, it became the starting point for real change. He looked at Reynolds, who nodded encouragingly. The presentation screen behind him showed impressive statistics. Racial profiling incidents down by 45% in their city, police complaints reduced by half, and most importantly, a dramatic improvement in community trust scores. But Marcus wasn't here just to share numbers. "Today, I want to introduce you to some people who represent the real success of our program," he said, gesturing to a group of people waiting at the side of the stage. First came Officer Sarah Chen and Marcus Thompson, the teenager she had met during training. They now led workshops together, helping other departments understand both sides of police-community interactions. Marcus Thompson had decided to become a police cadet while attending college. "A year ago, I wouldn't have trusted any officer," Marcus Thompson told the audience. "Now I'm becoming one, because Officer Chen showed me how police and community can work together." Next came Mrs. Robinson, the elderly woman who had first offered them lemonade on her porch. She now hosted monthly dinners where officers and neighbors shared meals and stories. These dinners had become so popular that other neighborhoods started their own versions. "In 40 years living in my neighborhood, I never knew a police officer's first name," Mrs. Robinson said. "Now I know 20 of them, and they know my famous lemonade recipe." The audience laughed, but they understood the deeper meaning. Small moments of connection had grown into lasting relationships. Reynolds took the podium next, looking confident in his sergeant's uniform. "When Judge Williams first suggested this program, I thought it was just about avoiding complaints or improving our image. I was wrong. It's about becoming the officers we always should have been." He shared stories about changes in his department. Officers volunteering at community centers, joining neighborhood cleanup efforts, and attending local events not as security, but as participants. More importantly, he talked about changes in how they approached their daily work. "Every traffic stop, every call, every interaction is a chance to build trust," Reynolds explained. "We're not just enforcing laws anymore, we're building relationships." The most powerful moment came when they showed a video of their latest graduating class. It included equal numbers of new officers and community members, all trained together in understanding each other's perspectives. They called themselves bridge builders, and their approach was spreading to other cities. After the presentation, as people crowded around to ask questions and share their own stories, Marcus noticed something significant. The questions weren't about policies or procedures. They were about people, how to build trust, how to overcome resistance, how to create real connections. Later that evening, Marcus and Reynolds sat in the hotel restaurant, reflecting on their journey. "Did you ever imagine that night would lead to all this?" Reynolds asked, looking at the conference materials spread across their table. Marcus smiled. Actually, I did. The moment you admitted your mistake and showed a willingness to learn, that's when I knew something important could happen. They were interrupted by a text message on Reynolds' phone. It was from his department back home. Another city had just adopted their program, making it the 20th one this year. You know what's really amazing? Reynolds said, looking up from his phone. We're changing how the next generation sees police. Those kids in our program, they're going to grow up knowing officers as people who help build community, not just enforce laws. Marcus nodded. And the officers are learning too. Every time they sit down with a community member, every time they hear someone's story, they become better at their jobs. As they looked out the hotel window at the capital city lights, both men felt the weight of what they had accomplished. A single traffic stop had transformed not just their lives, but their entire approach to justice and community. And they were just getting started. 2 years had passed since that night when Officer Reynolds pulled over Judge Williams. On a warm spring evening, they stood together in the city park, watching hundreds of people gather for the Bridge the Gap anniversary celebration. Food trucks lined the paths, children played basketball with off-duty officers, and music filled the air. Marcus's son James, now in college studying criminal justice, stood at a booth where he helped young people register for the police academy. Next to him, Sergeant Reynolds' daughter Katie handed out information about community programs. The two families had become close friends over the past 2 years, their children representing the next generation of change. Remember when we could barely get officers and community members to sit in the same room? Reynolds asked, watching the natural way people mingled and laughed together. Marcus nodded, thinking back to those tense early meetings. Now look at this, he said, gesturing to the scene before them. A group of officers was teaching kids how to operate their patrol car sirens. Nearby, community members served homemade food to police families. The local news crew arrived to cover the event. Their reporter, Lisa Chen, had been following the program's progress since its beginning. She approached Marcus and Reynolds with her camera crew. 2 years ago, you two met during a traffic stop, she began. Now your program has spread to 50 cities across the country. Did you expect this kind of success? Reynolds looked at Marcus before answering. The success isn't in the numbers, he said. It's in the stories. Like Officer Martinez over there, he used to get 3 complaints a month. Now he hasn't had one in a year because he learned to see the community as partners, not problems. Marcus added, and it's stories like Kevin Thompson, who used to run away every time he saw a police car. Now he's in the police academy, wanting to be the kind of officer he wished he'd met when he was younger. The celebration included a special ceremony honoring the program's achievements. Crime rates had dropped significantly. Police recruitment from minority communities had increased by 200%, but most importantly, trust between police and citizens had reached its highest level in the city's history. Mrs. Robinson, now the program's community coordinator, took the stage. 2 years ago, I was afraid to call the police when I saw trouble in my neighborhood, she said. Today, I have 5 officers' numbers in my phone, and they have my lemonade recipe. The crowd laughed, but her point was serious. Real change had come not from policies or procedures, but from relationships. Later in the evening, as families enjoyed dessert and children played games with officers, Marcus's wife Patricia joined him and Reynolds. James told me he wants to start a similar program at his college, she said proudly. He says every campus police department needs this kind of training. Reynolds smiled. Katie's high school is interested too. They want to start a youth version of the program. As the sun began to set, Marcus watched a young black officer help a little girl fly a kite. The officer was one of their program's first graduates. Nearby, an elderly white couple chatted with a group of teenage boys about their basketball game. No fear or suspicion in sight. You know what the best part is? Marcus said thoughtfully. This isn't a program anymore. It's just how things are now. Reynolds nodded. The other day, I was training a new officer. He couldn't believe it when I told him how things used to be. For him, this is normal. Talking to people, building trust, being part of the community. As the celebration wound down, families began heading home. Officers and citizens hugged goodbye like old friends. Children waved to their favorite police officers, calling them by name. Marcus and Reynolds stood at the park entrance, watching people leave. A new recruit approached them, asking for advice. Just remember, Reynolds told her, every interaction is a chance to build a bridge. Marcus smiled at the familiar words. 2 years ago, a traffic stop could have ended very differently. Instead, it had started a movement that was changing how police and communities saw each other, one conversation at a time. As they walked to their cars, both men knew their work wasn't finished. There would always be more bridges to build, more understanding to create. But they had shown that change was possible, one small moment at a time. And that was a legacy worth building.